The insult in the hallway, the ocean air that clung to the Caldwell estate each morning carried a deceptive softness, masking the sharp divide between those who lived inside its towering walls and those who served within them. The estate itself sat perched on a cliff edge, its sprawling balconies and glass walls catching the pale gold of the early California sun. In that light, the stone driveway glistened like polished silver, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the open archways. From the carefully pruned gardens, it was here, in this setting of calculated perfection, that Elena Brooks began her day, in a navy blue cleaning uniform that had been washed so many times the seams were beginning to fade. She moved silently through the west corridor, her left hand gripping a dust rag, her right balancing a silver spray bottle, tracing circles over the mahogany wall panels polished to a near-mirror finish. The scent of lemon oil floated up as she worked, mingling with the faint salt of the ocean. She kept her eyes down, her movements methodical, aware that in this house, staff who blended into the background tended to keep their jobs longer. The stillness of the hallway broke with the rhythmic, deliberate click of high heels approaching. From the far end, Elena did not need to look up to know who it was. She had learned to read the cadence of every step in the Caldwell household. From the hurried scuff of the young gardener's boots to the sharp authority of the house's owner, Vanessa Caldwell. In the faint reflection on the polished wood, Elena saw the woman coming toward her, tall, impeccably styled, her platinum blonde hair swept into a sleek chignon, the gleam of her diamond earrings catching the light as she walked. Her cream-colored pantsuit was perfectly tailored, the fabric flowing like water over her frame. Every inch of her radiated a kind of cold, expensive poise. Vanessa's gaze fell on Elena in that quick, assessing way she had, like scanning an object to determine if it belonged in her world or not. She slowed her pace just enough to let her eyes travel from Elena's scuffed work shoes to the rag in her hand. Then, without breaking stride, she stopped beside a leather armchair positioned in a recessed alcove of the hallway, an antique piece imported from Italy, with deep burgundy upholstery that glowed richly under the light. She rested her manicured fingers on the chair's backrest. Her nails painted a shade of pale rose that looked effortless but was undoubtedly chosen by a professional stylist. "Wipe that armchair spotless, dear," Vanessa said, her tone smooth and airy, though there was a sharpness tucked beneath it. Then, after the briefest pause, she added, "Maybe then I'll let you stand beside it for a photograph. Sitting, however," her mouth curled into the faintest smirk, "is for people who belong here." The words landed with a quiet, devastating precision. Elena's spine stiffened, though she kept her gaze fixed on the wood paneling. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a wave of humiliation pressing against her ribs. Her fingers tightened around the rag until her knuckles whitened. The easy choice, the one she had learned from years of working in spaces like this, was to say nothing, to let the insult pass as though it hadn't been heard. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her shoulders to stay steady. She knew how quickly these people could twist a moment of self-defense into a reason for dismissal. Inside, however, her mind was far from still. The words rolled over her in echoes. Belong here. Stand. Maybe each one another reminder that to Vanessa Caldwell, she was not a person but a fixture in the house, like the marble floors or the crystal sconces, existing only to maintain the illusion of perfection. In that instant she thought of her mother, Lillian, whose tired eyes stared back at her each evening when she returned home. The fine lines deepened, not just by age but by years of worry. She thought of the oxygen machine that hissed softly in the corner of their living room, a mechanical metronome marking the rhythm of survival. She thought, too, of her younger brother, Jay, barely 17, whose acceptance letter to an out-of-state college still clung to the fridge with a magnet, a promise they had yet to figure out how to afford. Elena swallowed hard, locking her focus on the wood grain in front of her, using the repetitive motion of wiping to steady the pulse hammering in her ears. She understood the unspoken truth here. In a house like this, silence was often the only form of defense the powerless were allowed. Speaking out would cost her more than her pride? It could cost her the paycheck that kept her family afloat. And yet, even as she forced her body to remain composed, there was a seed of something else taking root inside her, something stubborn and unyielding. Vanessa moved on without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking away down the hall. The faint scent of her perfume, jasmine layered over expensive sandalwood, lingering in the air. Elena let out the breath she'd been holding, her rag still pressed against the chair. For a moment she considered stopping, just leaving it untouched out of quiet rebellion. But she didn't. She finished the task, running the cloth over every inch of leather until it gleamed under the light. Not for Vanessa, but for herself, for the part of her that refused to let someone else's cruelty dictate the pride she took in her work. As the echo of Vanessa's footsteps faded into the distance, Elena straightened, placing the spray bottle back into the cleaning cart. She knew there would be another event tonight, another parade of strangers in designer clothes, another night of holding trays and smiling through the sting of casual condescension. She also knew that she would be there, silent and watchful, gathering every word, every moment, storing them like threads in a fabric she was weaving in her mind. Not a tapestry of submission, but one of evidence, strength, and something dangerously close to defiance. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows shifted slightly, turning from gold to a softer, paler hue as the ocean breeze swept in. Somewhere deep in the house, the sound of distant laughter floated down the hall, a high, clear laugh that did not belong to anyone who had ever scrubbed these floors. Elena adjusted the cuff of her uniform sleeve and moved, her cart forward, her steps steady, her eyes scanning ahead. She had learned to survive here by being invisible. But she also knew, though she could not yet say why or how, that invisibility had its limits, and on that quiet morning in the hallway of the Caldwell estate, as she passed the gleaming leather chair Vanessa had deemed not for her, Elena Brooks felt something shift inside her. It was small, almost imperceptible, the faintest stirring of a resolve that would, in time, change everything. The night of small cuts by the time the sun began to dip into the horizon, the Caldwell estate had transformed into something almost unrecognizable from the quiet hallways of the morning. The west lawn, which only hours earlier had been dotted with gardeners trimming hedges, was now a shimmering expanse of silk-draped tables, crystal wine glasses, and towers of fresh orchids imported from Singapore. From the kitchen, the smell of rosemary-seared lamb and truffle butter wafted into the corridors, carried on bursts of heated voices as the catering team moved in a tight, frantic rhythm. Inside, chandeliers glowed in every room, their light bouncing off polished marble floors that gleamed like still water. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and something else, the faint, unspoken electricity of people who had come not just to support the charity in name, but to be seen supporting it. Elena adjusted the collar of her navy uniform as she stood by the service counter, a silver tray balanced easily on her palm. On it were artfully arranged smoked salmon canapes, each crowned with a sliver of lemon zest so fine it could have been cut by a jeweler. Chef Morales caught her eye from across the kitchen, his weathered face softened by a brief smile. "Steady hands, Elena," he said in his warm, gravelly voice. "The night will be long, but storms always pass." She gave a small nod, grateful for the rare kindness, and pushed through the swinging door into the main hall. The moment she stepped into the crowd, the hum of conversation enveloped her. Voices overlapped, laughter here, a sharp whisper there, while the clinking of glassware punctuated the air like a steady metronome. She moved between clusters of guests, offering her tray with a polite smile that was neither too warm nor too cold. She had learned to find that perfect balance. Enough to seem approachable, but not enough to invite familiarity that could turn ugly. The faces around her were painted in confidence and money, men in tuxedos discussing mergers and acquisitions as if they were talking about the weather, women in glittering gowns that caught the light with every movement, their diamonds whispering. Of fortunes old and new. It began almost immediately, the small, almost invisible pricks that left no physical mark but cut deep nonetheless. A woman in a floor-length black gown with a string of pearls that could have paid Elena's rent for 2 years took a canape from her tray, paused, then frowned faintly. "I do hope these were prepared with gloves," she said, her voice perfectly pitched to be overheard by the group beside her. "One never knows about hygiene." The words hung there, pointed and deliberate. Elena's smile didn't falter, but she felt her chest tighten. She moved on before her silence could be mistaken for consent to more. A few steps later, a young man in a tuxedo tapped his empty champagne flute against the edge of her tray. The sharp, rhythmic clink drew a few glances from those nearby. "Faster, sweetheart," he murmured, not even looking at her as he scanned. "The room for someone more important. You'll lose your tip." She wanted to tell him there was no tip. Not for her. The service charge was absorbed into the estate's coffers, but she bit the inside of her cheek instead. The taste of iron bloomed faintly on her tongue, a reminder to keep her thoughts where no one could read them. In the corner of the room, half hidden by a heavy velvet curtain that led to the kitchen, her mother stood quietly. She had come that evening to bring Elena a jar of homemade soup, knowing she'd be too exhausted to cook after the gala. Elena hadn't expected her to linger, but there she was, watching her daughter move through the minefield of privilege with the grace of someone who knew exactly where the explosives were, because she had stepped on enough herself. Her mother's hands were folded, but her eyes tracked every interaction. Every sidelong glance, every smirk, hours blurred into one another. Elena's feet ached in the low, practical shoes she wore, her shoulders stiff from carrying trays through the shifting maze of guests. And then came the moment, small, almost unremarkable to anyone else, that carved itself into her memory. Near the center of the ballroom, a tall, broad-shouldered guest with a faint flush of gin across his cheeks stumbled slightly. His crystal wine glass slipping from his fingers, it hit the marble floor and shattered in a spray of shards. "Oops," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Clean it up for me, darling." She crouched without a word, careful not to let the tray in her left hand tip as she reached with her right to gather the pieces. The glass was jagged, catching the light in sharp little flashes. Just as her fingers brushed the last fragment, the man shifted his stance, and his polished leather shoe came down hard, deliberately on her hand. The pain was instantaneous, shooting through her knuckles and up her arm, sharp enough to make her breath hitch. She tried to pull away, but the weight didn't lift, and that was when the sound came, not from her, but from across the room. "Get your foot off my daughter." The voice was low but carried like a clap of thunder through the marble and gilt hall. Heads turned, conversations froze mid-sentence. Vanessa Caldwell herself appeared at the edge of the crowd, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Elena's mother was already moving toward them, her frame small but unyielding, every step charged with the kind of protective fury that no social code could contain. She didn't glance at Vanessa, didn't bow to the room's unspoken hierarchy. Her entire focus was on the man pinning her daughter to the floor, the shoe lifted. Elena withdrew her hand slowly, flexing her fingers even as pain throbbed in the joints. She rose to her feet, her mother's hand immediately finding her elbow. Around them, the glittering crowd looked on with varying shades of discomfort, curiosity in some eyes, disdain in others, and in a few, something like shame. It was a moment that should have passed quickly, swept aside under the endless tide of conversation and music. But it didn't. It sat in the air, thick and heavy, the first crack in the carefully maintained facade of the Caldwell estate's perfection. And though no one could know it yet, it was a crack that would only grow wider in the nights to come. Cast out for a heartbeat, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The music faltered, a violinist missing a note as the tension rippled outward from the center of the room. The warm glow of the chandeliers felt harsher now, catching on. The sharp angles of crystal glasses and polished silver, making the space seem suddenly brittle. Elena stood with her mother's hand gripping her arm, the sting in her fingers a dull throb beneath the pulse of humiliation burning in her chest. Around them the wealthy guests shifted, some glancing at one another as if waiting for someone. else to step in, others wearing expressions that hovered between curiosity and mild irritation, as though this was an unfortunate but temporary disruption in their carefully curated evening got through the press of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Vanessa Caldwell emerged like a blade drawn from a sheath. Her cream pantsuit, immaculate despite the crowded room, caught the light with every step. Her chin was high, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes, sharp and cold as glass, locked on Elena's mother with the kind of gaze that could strip the air from a room. "What?" she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made the nearest guests lean back slightly. "Is the meaning of this display?" Lillian Brooks, barely 5'3" and wearing a cardigan that had seen better days, did not flinch. She met Vanessa's gaze head-on, her own eyes bright with a protective fire that burned past fear or etiquette. "She's my daughter," she said, each word steady, deliberate, and threaded with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the moment itself. "And I will not stand here while you and your guests treat her like she's worth less than the floor she cleans." The room went utterly silent. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is my home, Mrs. Brooks. My guests come here for elegance and refinement, not drama." The word drama rolled off her tongue like something distasteful. "If you cannot conduct yourselves with the decorum befitting this house, then you are not welcome in it." There was a collective shifting in the crowd as though the words had been a signal. Some turned away in discomfort, pretending to focus on their drinks. Others leaned forward slightly, eager for the spectacle to unfold. A man near the fireplace whispered something to his wife, and she covered her mouth to hide a small, scandalized smile. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend her mother, to tell Vanessa exactly what she thought of her decorum, but she could feel her mother's hand, firm against her arm, holding her back. Lillian's voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Maybe your guests would enjoy a little truth with their champagne," she said. "Maybe they should see what elegance really costs the people who keep it polished." That was the final thread. Vanessa's expression shifted, not to outrage, but to something colder, more final. "Out," she said softly, and yet her voice cut through the room like the crack of a whip. "Both of you, now." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her authority in this place was absolute, and she wielded it like a weapon she had used 1,000 times before. "I pay for service," she added, her tone smooth but laced with ice, "not for disruptions." The crowd parted as if by instinct, creating a narrow path to the double front doors. Elena's heart pounded in her ears as she and her mother walked through the space, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her back, some judging, some pitying, some curious to see how far the humiliation would go. She kept her chin level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. When they stepped into the night, the sudden cool of the ocean air hit like a slap. The doors closed behind them with a soft but decisive thud, the sound final and unyielding. The driveway stretched ahead, lit by the golden glow of ornate lanterns that lined the path, their light catching on the glossy leaves of the manicured hedges. In the distance, the faint crash of waves against the cliffs whispered through the silence between them. Elena's hand still ached from where the man's shoe had pressed down, but it was nothing compared to the knot of anger and shame twisting in her chest. Her mother's hand stayed on her arm, steady and grounding. "Let's get your things from the staff quarters," Lillian said, her voice low. "We'll take the bus home." Elena nodded, the taste of salt on her lips from the wind, or maybe from the tears she hadn't realized were threatening to rise. They had taken only a few steps toward the smaller path that led to the staff wing when a flicker of movement caught Elena's attention. She glanced up toward the ballroom's tall windows and froze. Shadows moved frantically against the sheer curtains, the light inside rippling as if disturbed by something chaotic. Then came the telltale curl of smoke, faint at first, then thicker, darker, spreading upward. Her breath caught just as the sound reached her, muffled at first, then sharp enough to pierce the night. It was a child's voice, high and panicked, screaming one word over and over. Fire! The sound sliced through the ocean wind, through the memory of Vanessa's cold dismissal, through everything that had just happened. For a split second, Elena stood rooted to the spot, her mind torn, between the sting of being cast out and the instinct to run toward the danger. Then she met her mother's eyes, and in that brief exchange, the decision was made. They dropped everything, the humiliation, the pain, even the bags they had been about to retrieve, and turned back toward the mansion at a dead run. Into the fire, the sound of that child's voice, high, shrill, and edged with panic, seemed to slice the night in two. For Elena, the sting of being cast out evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sharp, almost physical jolt of instinct. The cool ocean breeze was no match for the sudden heat that roared to life in her veins. She didn't think about Vanessa Caldwell's words, didn't think about the sea of faces that had just watched her and her mother walk out in disgrace. All she could think about was that voice. Somewhere inside those towering glass walls, a child was screaming for help. Smoke curled thicker now behind the ballroom's tall windows, blooming into dark clouds that blurred the warm light inside. The faint orange flicker that had been visible just moments ago swelled into something more insistent, shadows lurching and distorting as if the walls themselves were moving. In the distance, a guest's voice shouted, "Fire! Get out!" The double doors burst open, and people began spilling onto the front lawn, women clutching glittering handbags, men shielding their faces from the growing plumes. The scent of burning fabric mixed with something acrid and chemical, stinging Elena's nostrils even from the driveway. Lillian didn't wait for instructions. She grabbed her daughter's arm, her voice steady despite the urgency. "Side entrance," she said. "The front's going to be chaos." Together, they sprinted along the stone path that curved around the estate toward the narrow service door that led into the staff corridor. Elena's shoes slapped against the flagstones, her breath coming faster, the burn in her chest matching the heat she could already feel radiating from the building. As they approached, she could hear the muffled thunder of people shouting over each other, the high-pitched chirp of the estate's fire alarms echoing through the hallways. They burst through the side door into a corridor hazy with smoke, the air thick enough to make their eyes water immediately. Elena pulled the collar of her uniform over her mouth and nose, breathing shallowly as her mother did the same. The heat was oppressive, seeping into their skin as they moved deeper into the house. Somewhere above them, a sprinkler had burst, sending a stream of water cascading down and pattering against the marble like rain. The sound was almost gentle compared to the angry crackle of flames they could now hear in the distance. It was Lillian who heard it first, the muffled, choked sob of a child. "This way," she said, pointing toward the East Library. They moved quickly, dodging a toppled table and stepping over shards of glass that glittered faintly even through the haze. When they reached the doorway, Elena's heart seized. The heavy oak door was partly closed, and through the gap she could see a boy no older than 8, crouched in the far corner, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His small frame was illuminated by the jagged light of flames that were climbing hungrily up the drapes. The air in the room shimmered with heat. Elena didn't hesitate. She shoved the door open, the hinges groaning, and rushed inside. "Hey!" she called, her voice as calm as she could make it, despite the adrenaline surging in her veins. "We're here to get you out." The boy's head snapped up, his wide eyes glistening with tears and reflecting the fire's orange light. He coughed violently, his voice raw when he tried to speak. I can't breathe." She knelt in front of him, keeping her voice low and steady. "We're going to move together, okay? You hold on to me and we'll get you where the air's better." He nodded weakly, and she wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him up against her side. Lillian moved in close, shielding them from a falling ember that hissed as it hit the floor beside them. The heat was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides. Every breath burned in Elena's throat. She could feel the boy's trembling through his thin dress shirt, his small hand clutching at her sleeve with desperate strength. Together, the three of them moved back toward the door, ducking under the thickest of the smoke. Their shoes slipping slightly on the water-slick floor, they emerged into the corridor, just as part of the ceiling in the library collapsed behind them, sending up a burst of sparks that lit the air like a violent, fleeting constellation. Elena didn't look back. She tightened her grip on the boy and pushed forward, following her mother toward the nearest exit. The side door they had entered through was blocked now. 2 catering carts overturned in the chaos, their contents scattered, flames licking dangerously close. Lillian didn't break stride. "Main hall," she called over her shoulder. It was a longer route, but it would have to do. The 3 of them wove through the haze, passing panicked staff and guests, who barely noticed them in their rush to escape. Elena caught flashes of familiar faces, a server she'd trained with, a driver she passed every morning, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. When they reached the main hall, the open front doors glowed like a promise at the far end, framed by the golden light of the exterior lanterns and the dark sky beyond. The cool night air seemed impossibly far away. Elena could feel the boy's breathing grow more ragged, his weight heavier against her. "Almost there," she whispered. Though she was speaking as much to herself as to him, they broke into the open air just as another section of the roof gave way behind them, sending a fresh wave of heat rolling out into the night. Guests on. The lawn turned at the sight of them, the soot-smeared young woman, the older woman at her side, and the coughing, trembling boy they half carried between them. Someone shouted, "That's Daniel." And a voice, Vanessa's voice, rang out above the din, sharp and unsteady. "Daniel!" She pushed through the crowd, her hair falling loose from its perfect chignon, her hands trembling as she reached for her son. Elena handed him over without a word. For a moment their eyes met. Vanessa's gaze stripped of its practiced hauteur, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Gratitude, perhaps. Or shock. Or maybe the uncomfortable collision of both. But before either woman could speak, the firefighters surged past, their voices brisk and commanding as they moved to contain what was left of the blaze. The night air was filled with the hiss of water, the crackle of flame, and the quiet, disbelieving murmurs of the crowd. Elena stepped back, her chest heaving, the taste of smoke bitter on her tongue. She could feel her mother's hand on her back, steady and grounding, and for the first time since the evening began, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The humiliation of an hour ago was still there, buried under the ash and adrenaline, but now it sat beside something else, something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous to the world Vanessa Caldwell had built, the offer-by. The time the last tongues of flame had been subdued, and the firefighters began winding up their hoses. The Caldwell estate no longer resembled the gleaming monument to wealth it had been at the start of the evening. The East Library was gutted, its once pristine shelves reduced to blackened skeletons of char and ash, and the air around the mansion still carried the acrid sting of smoke, clinging to hair, clothes, and skin. In the early dawn light, the great stone facade seemed humbled, as though the fire had stripped away not just its physical splendor, but also the unspoken arrogance that had always hovered over it. Elena and her mother sat on the far edge of the lawn, wrapped in blankets the paramedics had draped over their shoulders. The adrenaline had drained from their bodies, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to settle into every joint and muscle. Elena's throat burned with each swallow from the smoke, and her scraped palms throbbed with a dull ache. She didn't care about any of it. The image of the boy, Daniel Caldwell, coughing and trembling in her arms, still played in her mind, not as a triumph, but as a reminder of how close he had come to being lost. For a long time, the only sounds were the distant hum of the fire truck engines and the occasional murmur of firefighters conferring over their notes. Guests had either gone home or clustered in small groups farther down the lawn, their voices hushed, as if the early light demanded reverence. It was in this quiet that Vanessa Caldwell appeared, walking toward them with a slowness Elena had never seen in her before. Her cream pantsuit was torn at the sleeve, streaked with soot, and her once perfect hair hung loose around her shoulders. But her stride was steady, her eyes locked on the 2 women who had defied both her authority. and the inferno to save her son, she stopped a few feet away, as though uncertain how to close the final distance. For a moment she simply looked at them, her gaze moving from Elena's soot-streaked face to Lillian's steady, unflinching eyes, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the frost that had once defined it. "I owe you my son's life," she said quietly. The words seemed to cost her something, as if each one had to be pried loose from a place she'd never willingly opened before. "And I owe you both an apology." Elena studied her, noting the faint tremor in her hands. "An apology doesn't erase everything that came before," she said, her tone measured. Her mother glanced at her but didn't interrupt. Vanessa didn't flinch at the reply. "No, it doesn't," she admitted. "I can't change what I've done or the way I've treated you. But I can decide how I act from this moment forward. And I can make sure neither of you ever have to stand in this place invisible and disrespected again." She drew in a breath, glancing toward the smoldering remains of the East Wing before looking back. "From now on, Lillian, you're medical. Care is covered, every appointment, every prescription." "And Jay's tuition?" She shifted her gaze to Elena. "Paid in full, all 4 years. No conditions." Her words hung between them, heavy with sincerity but tinged with something else, the weight of a woman who was trying, perhaps for the first time in her life, to repay a debt she couldn't fully name. Elena's pulse quickened, but she said nothing. Vanessa stepped closer. "And you, Elena? I want you to stay here, not as a cleaner, as director of household operations. You'll have full authority over the staff. Salaries, training, hiring, everything. No one speaks down to you again, not under my roof." For a moment, the offer didn't feel real. The title sounded almost absurd against the memory of Vanessa's voice in the hallway the day before, telling her she wasn't fit to sit in a chair. Elena's instinct was to refuse, to walk away from this house forever, to take her mother and brother somewhere far from the weight of these walls. But then she thought of the staff inside, the ones who had endured the same small humiliations she had, the ones who would never be in a position to negotiate with Vanessa Caldwell. She thought of how many more years her mother's health might hold steady if she could access the best care without worrying about bills. And she thought of Jay, of the letter on the fridge, of the future he deserved. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but her eyes were unyielding. "If I take this job, it's not just for me, it's for every person who works here. Respect isn't optional. Not from the guests, not from the family, not from anyone." Something flickered in Vanessa's expression, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of condescension but of recognition. "Agreed," she said simply. Elena gave a single nod. "Then I'll do it." It wasn't triumph she felt in that moment. It was something quieter, heavier. A sense of stepping into a place she hadn't sought, but now understood she might be the only one able to hold. Somewhere inside her, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. This house had been built on more than stone and glass. It had been built on a hierarchy so old it was practically woven into the walls. But she also knew this. The fire had cracked that structure open. And now there was light seeping in. Vanessa extended a hand, and after a beat, Elena took it. The shake was brief but firm, a gesture of agreement and something like respect. In the background, the first rays of sunlight broke fully over the ocean, gilding the blackened ruins of the library in gold. The estate looked wounded, yes, but also strangely alive, as if it, too, was bracing for the change to come. A new order. The days that followed the fire moved like a strange dream, equal parts exhaustion and momentum. The Caldwell estate, still carrying the scars of the blaze, became a place of constant movement. Contractors moved through the halls with tool belts and ladders, the sharp scent of fresh lumber mixing with the lingering undertone of smoke. The grand library remained cordoned off behind thick sheets of plastic, its blackened beams and warped shelves a stark reminder of how quickly fortune could catch flame. But amid the wreckage, there was a different kind of construction underway. One that couldn't be measured in square footage or marble polished. Elena stepped into her new role not with fanfare, but with quiet, deliberate intent. The first morning she walked into the staff meeting as Director of Household Operations. The room was still heavy with uncertainty. Faces turned toward her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Some of the staff had worked here for decades and had long since learned to survive by staying silent, keeping their heads down no matter what was said or done to them. Others, younger, newer, carried the raw, restless energy of people who wanted better but weren't sure how to get it. She began not with a speech, but with a simple declaration. We're going to run this house differently. Everyone here, from the groundskeepers to the catering staff, deserves respect. That's not up for negotiation. If a guest can't give it, they'll be told so. If anyone here witnesses harassment, it's reported immediately. And salaries, she paused, letting the room absorb the weight of the word, will be reviewed and adjusted where they've been unfair. There was a murmur, the sound of disbelief rubbing against cautious optimism. Marcus, the head chef, who had always offered her quiet kindness, gave a single nod, his weathered face betraying something like pride. Gloria, the longtime assistant house manager who had once been Vanessa's silent enforcer, crossed her arms and said nothing. Elena knew winning her over, or at least neutralizing her resistance, would take time. In the first weeks, change was met with pushback. A wealthy regular guest complained after being politely told by a server that the staff could not be spoken to like hired help from a century ago. Gloria warned Elena that ruffling feathers could jeopardize the estate's social standing. Elena didn't flinch. If respect costs us a few feathers, she said, then let them fall. Vanessa, to Elena's mild surprise, backed her more often than not. One afternoon, Elena overheard the matriarch on the phone with a donor who had expressed concern about changes in the house's atmosphere. Vanessa's voice was cool but unwavering. The atmosphere has improved. We treat people properly here now. If that's a problem, perhaps you'd be happier attending functions elsewhere. Still, the work was grueling. Elena found herself mediating disputes, retraining staff who had spent years under the old order, and constantly walking the fine line between firmness and fairness. There were moments she questioned whether she could hold this new position without being swallowed by the house's history. But each time she remembered why she'd accepted the role, not for herself alone, but for the people whose dignity had been invisible for too long. The moment that sealed the change came 6 weeks after the fire. On the night of the first gala since the East Library had been gutted, the ballroom gleamed as if nothing had happened, polished floors, glittering crystal, and music swelling from a live quartet. But beneath the surface, the energy was different. Staff moved with confidence, their heads high, their interactions with guests no longer shaded by fear of reprisal. Elena moved through the room. Not in a uniform, but in a tailored navy suit Vanessa had insisted on ordering for her. The weight of the jacket felt symbolic, not a costume but armor. She stopped to speak with Marcus at the buffet, offered a quiet word of encouragement to a nervous new server, and intercepted a guest whose tone toward a young caterer had begun to turn sharp. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority in her presence was enough. Midway through the evening, Vanessa appeared at her side, a glass of sparkling water in hand. "It's time," she said simply, nodding toward the head of the long dining table where the main donors had gathered. At the center sat the same deep burgundy leather chair. Elena had been told she wasn't fit to touch on her first week in the house. For a heartbeat. Elena stood still, memories colliding, the sting of those words in the hallway, the ache in her hand from the man's shoe, the suffocating heat of the library fire. Then she crossed the room. Conversations quieted as she approached, not because of who she had been, but because of who she had become. She pulled the chair out and sat, her posture straight, her gaze steady. The leather was cool against her palms, supple and worn from years of use, but now it felt entirely different. Her mother sat beside her, dressed simply but elegantly, her eyes glistening with a pride that needed no words. Across the table, her brother Jay grinned, the kind of grin that belonged to someone who could finally see his own future opening wide. Vanessa lifted her glass and, for the first time in Elena's memory, spoke to the room not about wealth or influence or tradition, but about change. "Tonight we're not just celebrating the restoration of this house," she said. We're celebrating the restoration of what matters inside it: respect, dignity, gratitude. Her gaze swept the table, then landed on Elena. And we are led, from this day forward, by someone who understands those things better than anyone here. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. Elena didn't need more than that. As she looked around the table, she understood something profound. The leather chair was never the prize. The real victory was everything it now represented: a house where silence no longer meant safety, where respect wasn't earned through servitude but given freely as a right. And as the music swelled again and the evening carried on, Elena sat in that chair not as a symbol but as proof. Proof that some fires, no matter how destructive, leave behind the kind of light that cannot be extinguished.